Hi all, welcome to the third part of my series on the French defence. Here I want to reinforce the first two lessons and look at particular names, variations and the pawn structure considerations. So after e4, e6, d4, d5. First of all, let's consider the exchange variation. So we have here a symmetrical pawn structure, which means less winning chances for either side. But white cannot force a draw by force, but can, by playing moves like bishop d3, c3 and knight f3 later, try not to do much and just end up with very solid position. The pawn structure really dictates the opportunities for both sides, but black can drum up interesting counterplay, for example an early bishop g4 in some variations, castling queenside, or making sure the symmetry of the pieces is not quite there. If white plays knight f3, black to later play bishop d6 and knight e7 to try and break some of the symmetry, at least of the piece symmetry, if not the pawn structure. So that's the exchange variation. The advanced variation next is this. So the pawn basically on e4 advances, and this was frequently played in the early days of the French. So Aaron Nimzowitsch used to play this with some very interesting hypermodern ideas. So him and his old arch enemy Siegbert Tarrasch were exchanging many ideas with this variation, because actually it's got some ideas like the pawn chain. Here, white's preserving this pawn chain, Nimzowitsch would call, and black's usual plan is to try and undermine white's pawn chain, especially the d4 square, which is the most exploitable part of that chain. But it's not only d4, black can later consider f6 as well, so instead of the base attack, it's attacking at the head, because there are dynamic considerations. If black bites white's pawn chain via f6 later, and white takes, then, after knight takes f6, for example, black would have semi-open f-file pressure, and usually, things like rook takes f3 often arise as possibilities. So the advanced variation is all about this pawn chain, and white's battle to either, keep it intact, or as Nimzowitsch demonstrated in some revolutionary games, even considering d takes c5 in some lines, to try and reinforce control of the e5 square, overprotect e5, and use piece pressure instead of pawn occupation. So there's many ideas revolving around this advanced variation. So the main line, so c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, and often, black was playing queen b6, but this waiting move, bishop d7, was also introduced, to see where white was going to play his cards first, and then either, black plays f6 or queen b6. So these kind of clever little innovations in the French involving these waiting moves are very, very interesting, and bishop d7 is certainly one of them. So now let's look at the Tarrasch variation. So the previous video looked at this Tarrasch variation, so Nimzowicz's arch enemy. So one of the advantages of the Tarrasch from a pawn point of view is that white can still play the move c3, so it rules out the whole of the mainline Winawer. If the bishop ever goes to b4, then white's simply got c3, kicking that bishop away. So bishop b4 is not a great option. So what are black's options here, and what are the names? c5 is different in personality to knight f6. So c5 is aiming often either to allow black to have an isolated pawn. If black takes on d5 like this, often black's ending up with this isolated queen pawn in exchange for dynamic piece activity. But black can also take with the queen on d5, and then black is often aiming to exchange the c pawn for the d pawn and gain piece play, but without an associated structural weakness on d5. So that's a very important alternative idea. And I've seen many very interesting games of British Grandmaster John Spillman in this line, with later, a6, b5, bishop b7, and these bishops being quite menacing, to white's king. So that's a very interesting alternative after e takes d5. But e takes d5 was featured in the early, those many Korchnoi-Karpov battles with this variation after e takes d5. So the main line, knight gf3, knight c6, bishop b5, pinning that knight, bishop d6, castles, knight g7, and here we see the emergence of the isolated queen pawn. So after bishop takes c5, knight b3, bishop b6. So black's prospects lie in the piece play. You know, black can often use the e4 square and trying to exploit this vulnerability of the f2 square. But you know, if white reaches the ending, this is going to often be a losing weakness, this isolated pawn. You know, black has to be careful to preserve counterplay. So after knight d2, the Tarrasch variation, it leads to many interesting avenues. Knight c6, I didn't really cover so far, is known as the Guimard variation, according to Wiki. So after knight gf3, knight f6, e5, knight d7. You notice though that black can't, you know, undermine on d4, so it has to be f6 to undermine white's pawn chain at the head of the chain, rather than this, you know, unexploitable base now, because black hasn't played c5. So that's the Guimard variation if you want something unusual. But there's also an intriguing number of new power tools in this line after knight d2. Bishop e7. So it's a very interesting waiting move. You know, I mentioned earlier about waiting moves, because if white tricked into playing knight f3, then knight f6, e5, knight fd7. So black's playing c5 here without worrying about the lines where white's got in f4. So this f4, f5 to try and undermine black is less of a concern. So that's one of the ideas of bishop e7, a subtle little waiting move. Another little waiting move is a6, with the idea of later playing c5, but ruling out those variations where we saw bishop b5 with the annoying pin on the knight. So that's another one. And intriguingly, h6 is also another interesting waiting move. So if you want some very quick deviations from opening theory, you know, there is so many rich waiting moves in the French defence like this. So this isn't as bad as it looks. It's got some similar ideas to encouraging this knight gf3 from white. You know, so black can like bite on white's pawn chain, you know, without white, you know, playing f4 and f5 later. So the Tarrasch is becoming quite popular nowadays. What else? So after d4, d5, the main line, though, is not the Tarrasch, it's this knight c3. So white's inviting this pin on the knight. But before we look at that variation, which is called the Winawer variation, or the mainline Winawer, the Rubenstein variation. So this is another guy in the era of Nimzowitsch and Tarrasch. Rubenstein's, you know, a real chess genius. Probably a little crazy though. After knight takes e4, you know, there are some games with bishop d7 to c6, that's like the Fort Knox variation. We've seen a video of James Howell beating Neil MacDonald recently in that, if you want to check that out. So the Rubenstein variation, capturing the centre straight away. So if this bishop can crawl out, you know, the bishop is usually the bad bishop of the French, so it's crawling out quickly, maybe exchanging on f3 later. But the main line is the Winawer, so bishop b4, and we briefly, you know, went into some example variations. So e5 is typical, c5, a3, bishop takes c3, bc. So white has the double pawns, but the two bishops, and these can often be menacing for the, you know, the white king later, especially this bishop on, you know, d3. Sometimes there's a possibility of the Greek gift sacrifice with bishop takes h7 later. So black has to be careful about castling kingside, and maybe, you know, should prepare even castling queenside rather cheekily, and then later playing like h6 and g5. So, you know, white's got the two bishops, and black, you know, will be better in the end game, or trying to probe these weaknesses on the queenside maybe sometimes in the middle game. There's all sorts of different strategies, but the pawn structure here, is dictating the flavour, and the two bishops versus, the knights here. So black's often trying to use the f5 square, or exchange off the light square bishop to, make use of the c4 square as well. So these light squares are important if this bishop especially is exchanged off. So it's all about outposts and less about undermining on d4, because white's got strong control of d4 here. So even though this would seem to be an exploitable pawn chain part, it's not so relevant in this variation. So this is the mainline Winawer.